In the 16th century, Spain held more wealth than any nation in the history of the world. Its empire stretched from the mines of Peru to the ports of the Philippines, from the Caribbean to the court of Vienna. The silver that flowed out of the mountain at Potosí, a single mine in what is now Bolivia, so productive it was called the mountain that eats men, exceeded everything Europe had extracted from the ground in the previous 1,000 years combined. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold from the Americas. It was the greatest single transfer of wealth in human history up to that point, and Spain went bankrupt 4 times in 50 years. The paradox at the center of this story is not a historical curiosity. It is one of the most important lessons the financial record has ever produced, and it is as relevant to the way modern economies function today as it was in 1557, when the most powerful empire on earth defaulted on its debts for the first time and left its creditors across Europe holding paper promises that the silver convoys could no longer honor. The lesson is this: treasure is not wealth. And the history of how Spain discovered that distinction, slowly, catastrophically, and at an enormous cost to ordinary people who never saw a single coin from the mines, is the subject of this video. Welcome to Hidden Ledger, where we open the books that were never meant to be public. If you want to understand the real mechanics of money before the next crisis makes them impossible to ignore, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every video we publish is another page of the ledger, the hidden one. When Hernan Cortez toppled the Aztec Empire in 1521 and Francisco Pizarro destroyed the Inca Empire a decade later, Spain did not merely acquire territory. It acquired access to mineral deposits so vast that the entire European concept of money had to be revised. The mines at Zacatecas in Mexico and Potosí in Peru operated continuously for over a century, fed by the forced labor of indigenous populations and later enslaved Africans, producing silver at a rate that had no precedent in recorded history. To appreciate what Spain was building at this time, consider a comparison that rarely appears in American history books. When Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in what would become the United States, was founded in 1607, it was a swamp of disease and starvation where half the settlers died in the first year. Mexico City, by contrast, already had universities, printing presses, cathedrals, and an administrative infrastructure that rivaled the great cities of Europe. St. Augustine in Florida, founded by Spain in 1565, was the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, a full 42 years before Jamestown. Spain was not a developing power tentatively exploring the New World. It was already governing a sophisticated urban civilization on the other side of the Atlantic, while England was still struggling to keep a handful of colonists alive in Virginia. And yet, this empire, which commanded more silver than all of Europe combined, which had built cities and universities in the Americas before England had a single viable colony, was financially hollow at its core. Because what Spain did with the treasure it received was not investment, it was consumption. And the distinction between those two uses of money is the entire story. The first consequence of Spain's silver flood was inflation, not the mild, manageable kind that central banks calibrate today, but a century-long detonation of prices that historians call the price revolution. Between 1500 and 1600, prices across Spain and much of Western Europe quadrupled. The mechanism was simple and devastating. Imagine a town where a loaf of bread costs 1 coin. Then 10 times more coins arrive in the same town, but the number of bakers and the number of loaves stays the same. The bakers quickly understand that people now have more coins than before, and they adjust their prices accordingly. Soon, bread costs 4 coins, not because the bread has changed, but because the coins are worth less. That is precisely what happened across Spain in the 16th century. The mountain at Potosí was producing coins faster than the Spanish economy could produce goods to absorb them. The result was not prosperity. It was the systematic erosion of the purchasing power of everyone who held the currency. The inflation did not hit everyone equally. The elites who handled silver first, the nobles, the merchants, the bankers closest to the point of entry, captured its value before prices adjusted. By the time the silver had filtered down through the economy to ordinary wage earners and peasants, prices had already risen to absorb it. The people furthest from the source of the money paid the full cost of its dilution. This is the Cantillon effect, operating at imperial scale, and it was as visible in 16th century Seville as it is in 21st century financial markets. Proximity to the source of new money determines who benefits and who absorbs the loss. The deeper failure was what Spain chose not to build while it was consuming its treasure. The silver flowing into Seville went straight back out again to Italian shipbuilders, Flemish merchants, German craftsmen, and Genoese bankers who supplied the goods and the credit that Spain no longer had the domestic capacity to produce. Spain had become a consumer in a world where its rivals were producers, and it had arrived at that position through deliberate choice. Why build factories or develop trade networks when the treasure fleet arrived twice a year? The result was an economy that looked wealthy on the surface and was structurally dependent at its foundation. The silver passed through Spain like water through a sieve, enriching the rival economies of Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, while hollowing out Spanish domestic industry. The Spanish crown compounded this structural weakness by borrowing against treasure that had not yet arrived. The Habsburg monarchs, who saw themselves not merely as rulers of Spain, but as the defenders of Catholic orthodoxy against the Protestant Reformation, had an insatiable appetite for military expenditure. Wars against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, the brutal suppression of the Dutch revolt, the intervention in the French wars of religion, the construction and deployment of the Armada against England in 1588. Each of these campaigns cost fortunes that the current year's silver fleet could not cover alone. The solution was debt. German banking dynasties, most notably the Fuggers of Augsburg, and later networks of Genoese financiers, advanced enormous loans to the Spanish crown secured against future silver shipments. The logic was seductive. Potosí would keep producing, the fleets would keep sailing, the loans would be repaid with interest, and the cycle would continue indefinitely. In practice, the system had one catastrophic vulnerability. If a fleet was delayed by storms, wrecked on a reef, or, as would become increasingly common, ever intercepted at sea, Spain could not service its debts. And when Spain could not service its debts, it defaulted 4 times in 50 years. 1557, 1555, 1596, 6 to 7. Each default sent shockwaves through the European financial system. Creditors who had lent against the security of future silver found themselves holding promises that the silver convoys could no longer honor. The Fugger banking dynasty, which had been one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe, was effectively destroyed by Spanish defaults. The irony embedded in those 4 dates is almost too perfect. The richest empire the world had ever seen, sitting on more silver than any kingdom in history, repeatedly telling its creditors that it could not pay. The Spanish Armada of 1588 illustrates the connection between military ambition and financial fragility with particular clarity. The fleet that Philip II assembled to invade England was the largest naval force in European history at that point. 130 ships, 18,000 soldiers, fueled by New World silver borrowed against future treasure. When the Armada was destroyed, by English naval tactics, by storms in the North Sea, by the simple fact that an invasion fleet is not the same as a productive economy, the financial shock was immediate. Spain had spent an enormous fraction of its annual silver revenue on a military gamble that failed, and it had borrowed to do so. The defeat was not just military. It was the moment at which the gap between Spain's apparent power and its actual financial fragility became impossible to ignore. Into this fragile system sailed the pirates. Not random marauders seeking adventure, but instruments of deliberate economic strategy deployed by Spain's rivals with the specific intention of collapsing its credit. England and the Dutch Republic understood something that Spain's creditors were slower to grasp. The treasure fleets were not just a source of wealth, they were the collateral for the entire Spanish financial system. Strike the fleets and you did not merely steal silver, you triggered sovereign default. Francis Drake, operating under letters of marque from Queen Elizabeth, circumnavigated the globe in the early 1580s, plundering Spanish shipping and returning to England with treasure estimated at half the crown's annual revenue. The Queen's return on her investment was extraordinary. Drake's investors received a return of approximately 4,700%. But the single most damaging blow was struck by the Dutch privateer Piet Hein in 1628, off the coast of Cuba. Hein captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet, the complete annual silver shipment from the Americas, worth 11 million guilders. In a single afternoon at sea, Spain lost the funds it had planned to use to service loans, pay its armies in the Low Countries, and maintain its position in the 30 Years' War, then consuming Central Europe. The Dutch West India Company, which had financed the raid, paid its shareholders a 50% dividend. The silver that had left the mines of Potosí to service Spanish imperial ambition ended up capitalizing Dutch commercial expansion instead. One fleet, one afternoon, and the foundations of the Spanish financial system cracked. As Spain staggered under the weight of its own treasure, its rivals were drawing the correct lesson from the spectacle. The Dutch and the English did not watch Spain's collapse with mere satisfaction. They studied it as a case study in the difference between two fundamentally opposed theories of how wealth is created and sustained. Spain's model was extractive. Its colonies in the Americas existed to funnel wealth to the metropole. They were not designed to grow into productive economies. They were designed to produce silver, and everything else, the cities, the universities, the administrative infrastructure, was in service of that single extractive purpose. When the silver ran out or the fleets were disrupted, the model had nothing else to offer. The Dutch model was systemic. Amsterdam's merchants founded the world's first modern stock exchange in 1602, creating a mechanism for pooling capital and distributing risk across thousands of investors. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, issued shares to the public and used the proceeds to build a global trading network that generated continuous returns rather than depending on single annual treasure fleets. When the Dutch captured Spanish silver through piracy or trade, they did not consume it. They reinvested it into navies, banking institutions, and commercial infrastructure. The English followed the same logic with the East India Company and the financial revolution centered on the Bank of England, founded in 1694, the institution we discussed in an earlier video in this series as the invention that made modern war finance possible. This is the crucial distinction that Spain's story makes permanent. Spain measured wealth in treasure, in the quantity of silver held at a given moment. Britain and the Dutch measured wealth in systems, in the capacity to generate value continuously over time. One is finite, one is self-replicating. The difference between those two measurements is the difference between the empire that dominated the 16th century and the empires that dominated everything that followed. By the mid-17th century, the empire that had terrified Europe for 100 years was visibly declining. The Armada was a memory. The Dutch Republic, whose revolt Spain had spent decades and billions of silver ducats trying to suppress, had gained independence and was building a commercial empire that would outperform Spain's extractive one within a generation. The 30 Years' War had drained what the pirates had not taken. Inflation had eroded domestic prosperity so thoroughly that ordinary Spaniards, the people who had never seen a coin from Potosí and never would, faced rising prices, stagnant wages, and taxes climbing to service wars that never seemed to end. The world's richest empire had eaten itself alive. The modern echoes of this history are not subtle. When floods of money arrive in an economy, whether from mines, printing presses, or emergency monetary expansion, the temptation is identical to the one Spain faced. Spend it, borrow against it, consume it. The discipline required to invest it in productive systems, to build institutions that generate value continuously rather than concentrating it momentarily, is the discipline that distinguishes economies that endure from those that collapse under the weight of their own apparent wealth. Spain's peasants felt the price revolution in the cost of bread long before any economist had a name for what was happening to them. Today, wage earners feel the same mechanism in grocery bills and rent, while the people closest to the source of monetary expansion capture its value before prices adjust. The pirates who targeted Spain's treasure fleets found the system's single point of failure and exploited it with devastating precision. Every modern economy that concentrates its systemic risk into institutions too large to absorb failure without catastrophic consequences is building the same vulnerability at a different scale. When one ship goes down, or one bank, or one sovereign credit rating, the shock travels instantly through every obligation that was secured against the assumption that the ship would arrive. Treasure is not wealth, silver is not security. The Spanish Empire learned this at the cost of a century of inflation, 4 sovereign defaults, and the gradual surrender of global dominance to rivals who understood the deeper game. The question that history puts to every generation that finds itself sitting on what looks like an infinite source of value is the same question it put to Philip II of Spain in 1557, the year his empire first declared bankruptcy. What are you building with it? If this opened a door you did not know was there, if you want to understand the hidden mechanics of money, power, and the rhythms of history that keep repeating whether or not we are paying attention, subscribe to Hidden Ledger. History is the only map we have. The question is whether you read it before you need it, or after.